January 10, 1956, Nashville, a Methodist television studio on McGavock Street. 21-year-old Elvis Presley stood in front of microphones at RCA Victor's recording facility, about to cut his first tracks for a major label. The company had paid $40,000 for his contract 4 months earlier, an unprecedented sum, a gamble that made industry insiders nervous. Steve Scholes, RCA's producer, had painted an X on the studio floor. Standard protocol. Singers were supposed to stand still, let the microphone capture every note cleanly. But as Elvis launched into Ray Charles' "I Got a Woman," something went wrong. Scholes noticed the sound cutting in and out. Elvis's voice, his guitar, both disappearing from the recording. The singer had moved off the mark. When Scholes asked what happened, Elvis gave him a simple answer. He had to jump around to sing it right. Something inside him demanded movement. It wasn't a choice. Scholes made a decision that would ripple through the next 70 years of music. He ordered the entire studio remiked. Every corner, every angle. So Elvis could move anywhere and still be captured. They were no longer recording a performance. They were recording a force. Outside that studio, the machinery of a massive promotional campaign was already in motion. RCA needed this to work. They'd invested more money in one untested singer than any label had before. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had demanded it, negotiated it, bet everything on it. In just 6 weeks, Elvis would make his national television debut. Millions would see him for the first time. The question hovering over that Nashville session wasn't whether Elvis could sing. It was whether America was ready for what happened when he did. The sale had closed on November 21, 1955. Sam Phillips, owner of Sun Records in Memphis, signed over Elvis Presley's contract to RCA Victor for $40,000. $5,000 more went to Elvis in back royalties. It was the largest amount ever paid for a single performer. RCA wasn't buying a singer. They were buying a gamble on a genre that didn't have a name yet. Rock and roll existed, but only in fragments, regional hits, teenage curiosity, something white parents worried about, and black artists had been perfecting for years. Elvis had spent 18 months at Sun, cutting singles that climbed regional charts. Country stations played him. So did some R&B stations. He didn't fit anywhere cleanly, which made him either worthless or invaluable depending on who you asked. Phillips believed in the latter. But Sun was a small label. Limited distribution, no national television access, no movie deals. Colonel Parker saw the ceiling and decided to smash through it. When RCA acquired Elvis, they inherited 5 Sun singles and several unreleased recordings. Good material, but not enough for a full album. And albums weren't the priority anyway. In 1956, teenagers bought singles. Albums were for adults who listened to Frank Sinatra and Broadway soundtracks. But RCA had another problem. They didn't know what to do with Elvis. He wasn't country enough for their country division. Too raw for pop. And putting a white singer in the R&B category felt politically impossible in 1956 America, where segregation was law in much of the South. So they did what desperate companies do. They threw everything at the wall and prayed something stuck. The plan: record new material in January, mix it with the best Sun recordings, package it as Elvis Presley, release it in March to capitalize on his upcoming television appearances. Simple. Except nothing about Elvis was simple. The industry was watching, waiting to see if this was a fad or a fracture in the foundation of American music. RCA had 6 weeks to find out. The Nashville sessions on January 10th and 11th felt wrong from the start. Scotty Moore and Bill Black, Elvis's guitarist and bassist since the Sun days, walked into RCA's professional facility and felt the air change. This wasn't Sam Phillips's cluttered studio in Memphis, where you could smoke between takes and joke with the engineer. This was corporate, detached, efficient. Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires arrived for backing vocals. Confused. The rest of his quartet hadn't been invited. Just him. Everyone was nervous. Everyone except Elvis. Chet Atkins, RCA's Nashville operations chief and a guitarist himself, watched Elvis attack I Got a Woman with everything he had. The energy stunned him. He called his wife mid-session, told her to come down to the studio. She needed to see this. But the technical problem persisted. Elvis moved too much. The sound kept cutting out. After Scholes rearranged the microphones, they captured Heartbreak Hotel, a song Elvis had heard at a disc jockey convention 2 months earlier, written by Mae Boren Axton and Tommy Durden after reading about a man's suicide note that said simply, "I walk a lonely street." The recording dripped with reverb. Scholes used a hallway at the studio to create an echo that sounded like loneliness had a physical space. It was eerie, unsettling, nothing like what was playing on pop radio. 2 weeks later, Elvis and the band traveled to New York for more sessions. January 30th and 31, they recorded 8 more songs, including Carl Perkins's Blue Suede Shoes. And that's where the complications started. Perkins's version was climbing the charts. A Sun Records release. Steve Scholes had promised Sam Phillips he wouldn't release Elvis's version as a single. It would protect Perkins, who was still recovering from a car accident that had killed his brother. But RCA wanted a hit, and Blue Suede Shoes sounded like one. The label made a compromise. They'd bury it as the opening track on an album, not a single, not direct competition. It felt like a gentleman's agreement in an industry that was running out of gentlemen. Back in Memphis, Sam Phillips watched his former protege record for a competitor and wondered if he'd made a mistake selling the contract. RCA had the money, the distribution, the television connections. But did they understand what they'd bought? The music on Elvis's debut album came from 2 different worlds. 5 tracks originated at Sun Studio. Material recorded between July 1954 and July 1955. Blue Moon. I Love You Because. Just Because. Trying to Get to You. I'll Never Let You Go. These were the songs Sam Phillips had captured when Elvis was still finding his voice. Country-leaning. Tender in places. The sound of someone learning what he could do. Then came the 7 new RCA recordings. Heartbreak Hotel. Blue Suede Shoes. Covers of Ray Charles, Little Richard, Clyde McPhatter. These were different. Louder. More confident. Electric in a way that made the Sun material feel like a prelude. The album created a strange tension. Past and present fighting for dominance on the same piece of vinyl. RCA's marketing team looked at the track list and panicked quietly. What genre was this? How were they supposed to sell it? Country stations wouldn't touch Little Richard. Pop programmers didn't know what to do with rockabilly. And putting Elvis in the R&B category would trigger a backlash RCA wasn't prepared to handle. The solution? Avoid the question entirely. They focused on Elvis himself. The look, the energy, the controversy already building around him. And the controversy was building. Regional newspapers had started running editorials. Youth pastors were taking notice. RCA's publicity department kept files of the complaints. Not enough to stop the machine. Just enough to know something larger was coming. Meanwhile, another problem emerged. Heartbreak Hotel was released as a single on January 27th. By late February, it was climbing the charts. Fast. RCA needed the album in stores immediately to capitalize on the momentum. But they'd only completed 2 rounds of recording sessions. Barely enough material for a full LP. The label made another compromise. Mixed the new recordings with the unreleased Sun tracks. Hoped the contrast felt intentional instead of desperate. It did. And it didn't. Critics would later argue that the album's lack of cohesion was part of its power, a snapshot of someone caught between what they were and what they were becoming. But in early 1956, cohesion was the last thing anyone cared about. They cared about whether Elvis could survive what was coming next. January 28, 1956, CBS Studios, New York City. Elvis Presley made his national television debut on Stage Show, hosted by big band leaders Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. He performed 2 songs, Shake, Rattle and Roll. I Got a Woman. The reaction was immediate. Teenagers screamed. Parents called the network. The Dorsey brothers booked him for 5 more appearances. This was the moment RCA had been waiting for. National exposure, millions of viewers, a direct pipeline into American living rooms, but exposure cuts both ways. By his 3rd appearance on February 11th, Elvis performed Heartbreak Hotel for the first time on television. The single started climbing faster. Within weeks, it would hit number 1. The controversy grew with it. Critics called his movements vulgar, obscene, a threat to the moral fabric of American youth. Time magazine mocked him. The Jesuits denounced him in their weekly publication. Frank Sinatra said his music fostered negative and destructive reactions in young people. On February 11, the same day Elvis performed Heartbreak Hotel on Stage Show, Carl Perkins's Blue Suede Shoes was also climbing the charts. The 2 versions existed in parallel. Perkins on Sun, Elvis on an album that hadn't been released yet. Then tragedy struck. In March, Carl Perkins was in a car accident. His brother Jay, who sang backup, was killed. Perkins himself was hospitalized for months. Scotty Moore later said Elvis performed Blue Suede Shoes on television as a tribute to Carl, not to compete, to honor a fellow Sun Records artist who couldn't perform it himself. The gesture was sincere. But sincerity doesn't control chart positions. Elvis's album version of Blue Suede Shoes began overshadowing Perkins's original in the public consciousness. Not immediately, but slowly, inevitably. Years later, people would associate the song with Elvis first, Perkins second. RCA hadn't released it as a single. They'd kept their promise, but they'd put it as the opening track on an album that was about to sell 1 million copies. Sometimes you don't need to break a promise. You just need to find a way around it. On March 23, 1956, RCA released Elvis Presley. The promotional campaign behind it was relentless. Television appearances, radio interviews, print ads. Colonel Parker had negotiated a 7-picture deal with Paramount. A movie career was already being planned before the album hit stores. Everything had been set in motion. There was no turning back now. The album cover stopped people cold. A photograph of Elvis mid-performance, mouth open, eyes half closed, guitar in hand, pure energy frozen in a single frame. The image had been taken at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa, Florida, on July 31, 1955. Photographer William V. Red Robertson captured something raw. Something that couldn't be faked. Rolling Stone would later rank it number 40 on their list of the 100 greatest album covers. But in March 1956, it just looked dangerous. Parents saw a young man who appeared to be in the middle of something inappropriate. Teenagers saw someone who looked like he didn't care what their parents thought. The music inside matched the cover. Blue Suede Shoes kicked off the album with Carl Perkins's rockabilly anthem. Then, I'm Counting on You, a ballad that reminded listeners Elvis could be tender. I Got a Woman brought the energy back. Ray Charles's R&B hit transformed into something looser, more chaotic. Then, One-Sided Love Affair. I Love You Because, Just Because. The album didn't build toward anything. It jumped. It swerved. Country melted into R&B. which crashed into rock and roll, which softened into ballads that sounded like they belonged on a different record entirely. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some praised the energy. Others dismissed it as a novelty act that wouldn't last. A few recognized something seismic but struggled to articulate what. Teenagers didn't care about articulation. They bought the album in unprecedented numbers. By the end of April, Elvis Presley had sold over 360,000 copies. At $3.98 per album, it became RCA's first million-dollar pop album by a single artist. On May 5th, it hit number 1 on Billboard's Top Pop Albums chart. The first rock and roll album to ever reach that position. It stayed there for 10 weeks, but the backlash was just beginning. On June 5th, Elvis appeared on The Milton Berle Show and performed Hound Dog with grinding hip movements that ignited a firestorm. Critics called it vulgar, a striptease with clothes on. Ed Sullivan declared Elvis unfit for family viewing. In August, Elvis arrived in Jacksonville, Florida for a series of shows. Local juvenile court judge Marion Gooding had arrest warrants prepared. The charge? Impairing the morals of minors. Preachers delivered sermons denouncing Elvis. One was titled Hot Rods, Reefers, and Rock and Roll. Elvis toned down his performance. The shows went on without incident. But the message was clear. This wasn't just music. This was a cultural threat, and the album was the entry point. By the end of 1956, the numbers told one story. Elvis Presley had placed more songs in the top 100 than any other artist since records were first charted. 5 number 1 singles. 10 million singles sold by RCA in a single year. The Wall Street Journal reported $22 million in merchandise revenue. In his first full year at RCA Victor, Elvis accounted for over half the label's single sales. The gamble had paid off. Spectacularly. But numbers never tell the whole story. Carl Perkins never achieved the stardom of Elvis. He became known for his songwriting. Blue suede shoes made him wealthy, but in the public imagination, the song belonged to someone else. Years later, Perkins reflected on Elvis with generosity. Said he had everything. The looks, the moves, the manager, the talent. It was grace from someone who'd lost his brother, and his moment in the same brutal stretch of months. For Elvis, the consequences were different. He'd become the focal point of a cultural war he didn't start. Adults saw him as corruption. Teenagers saw liberation. Both sides were using him to argue about race, sex, and the future of America. The music almost became secondary. Critics focused on his movements, his appearance, whether he was a threat or a savior or just a kid from Tupelo who got lucky. Few talked about what was actually on the album. The way it mixed black and white musical traditions without asking permission. The way it treated country and R&B as siblings instead of enemies. The way it made genre feel like an outdated concept. Elvis didn't invent that mix, but he made it undeniable. And the album was proof. The initial reviews of Elvis Presley were mixed. Some praised it, others dismissed it. But as the years passed, something shifted. Musicians started talking about what the album meant to them. John Lennon heard Heartbreak Hotel on Radio Luxembourg when he was 15. He later said he could hardly make out what was being said. It was just the experience of hearing it and having his hair stand on end. George Harrison described Heartbreak Hotel as a rock and roll epiphany. He was 13, riding his bike past a neighbor's house when he heard it. The moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. Paul McCartney said it was the way Elvis sang it, as if he was singing from the depths of hell. The phrasing, the use of echo. Musically, it was perfect. These weren't just compliments. They were confessions. The Beatles built their entire sound on a foundation that included this album. So did countless others. By the 1970s, critics began revisiting Elvis Presley with fresh ears. They heard things they'd missed the first time. The vulnerability in Blue Moon. The controlled chaos of Tutti Frutti. The way trying to get to you built from a whisper to a shout. They noticed how the album captured Elvis at a specific moment, not yet polished, not yet calculated, still willing to take risks that RCA would smooth out in later recordings. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked Elvis Presley at number 56 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. The ranking would shift in later editions, but the album never left the conversation. It couldn't. Too many artists owed their careers to it. Elvis Presley didn't just succeed, it redrew the map. Before March 1956, rock and roll was a singles format. Teenagers bought 45s. Albums were for adults. After Elvis Presley hit number 1, labels realized they could sell rock and roll in long form. That teenagers would buy albums if the artist mattered enough. The entire album industry shifted. More importantly, Elvis Presley proved that a major label could take a regional phenomenon and turn it into a national obsession. RCA's investment strategy became the blueprint. Sign the artist early. Pour money into promotion. Use television as a weapon. Every major label adopted it. Some artists benefited, many were crushed by the machinery. But the template came from Elvis. The album also changed how music crossed racial lines. Elvis didn't hide his influences. He named Arthur Big Boy Crudup, B.B. King, Ivory Joe Hunter, Fats Domino as artists who shaped him. In 1956, acknowledging debt to black musicians was radical for a white performer. It didn't erase the exploitation inherent in the system. Elvis made millions covering songs by black artists who struggled to get radio play. That imbalance was real and painful. But the album helped introduce white teenagers to black music. Ray Charles, Little Richard, Clyde McPhatter. Some of those teenagers went looking for the originals. Some became the artists who integrated rock and roll further. The long shadow of Elvis Presley is complicated. It launched a career that would define American pop culture for 2 decades. It made rock and roll financially viable for major labels. It opened doors for some artists while slamming them shut for others. And it created a sound that every rock and roll album that followed had to contend with. You either built on it or you fought against it, but you couldn't ignore it. Elvis Presley is the sound of a collision. Not just between country and R&B, not just between black and white musical traditions, but between the past and the future. Between what American music was and what it was about to become. The album didn't invent rock and roll. It didn't solve the racial inequities of the music industry. It didn't even represent Elvis at his creative peak. But it captured a moment when everything was uncertain. When a major label didn't know how to categorize their biggest investment. When critics couldn't decide if they were witnessing genius or degradation. When parents feared what their children were dancing to. That uncertainty is what makes the album matter. It shows us that cultural shifts don't arrive fully formed. They arrive messy, confusing, contradictory. Elvis Presley the album is all of those things. 5 soundtracks that sound like the past. 7 RCA tracks that sound like the future. No cohesion, no clear vision. Just a 21-year-old singer who moved too much for the microphones and a label that had to rearrange an entire studio to capture him. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the most important art doesn't come from careful planning. It comes from people trying to solve immediate problems. How do we record this kid who won't stand still? How do we sell an album that doesn't fit any category? How do we capitalize on television exposure before the moment passes? Those practical questions led to an album that changed everything. 70 years later, Elvis Presley still sounds like a beginning. Not the beginning of Elvis's career, not the beginning of rock and roll, the beginning of the idea that American music could be anything, that boundaries were negotiable, that genres were suggestions, that a kid from Tupelo could stand in front of a microphone and refuse to hold still and the whole world would have to adjust. The album is proof that adjustment happened, and proof that we're still adjusting.